What's up, people? I've always been really fascinated and in love with this intersection between painting and photography. There's some sort of magic I find in the gray area between the two, and I'd like to start off a little series and try to share and convey a little bit of that love with you. I'd like to start off talking a little bit through some of the elements that go into painting and photography and give you an idea of the different sets of constraints that painters and photographers face. Alright, so let's dig in here. What I love about painting is I feel it's one of the more direct and honest ways that we can convey our experiences to someone else. All forms of art are communication, and the ideal is really to take something, some concept, some feeling, some idea that's in your head and share part of that with the viewer. Or to set up an experience that's going to be different for every viewer. Both of these are great ways of communicating our thoughts about life and the world around us. So to set this up, first I'd like to talk about paintings. Paintings generally fall on a scale between two extremes. On the one extreme you have abstract painting, and on the other extreme you have figurative painting. So let's talk about the differences there and go through just a few quick examples to make the point. So when something is abstract, it's somehow independent from reality. Some of the qualities that I love about abstract work are that it detaches us. I'll show you what I mean. So here we have some great examples of some early 20th century abstract art. And as you can see, we're very much detached from reality here. We don't know exactly necessarily what these figures represent, if they represent anything at all. They've really just pulled us out of our reality and presented us with a more subjective experience. If you look at these examples from Mondrian, the art has been reduced down to just its most elemental design forms. And abstract art doesn't necessarily require a context. Often it's just meant to create an experience. Here, if we look at the work of some of the abstract expressionists, we see that through the use of color and texture and this raw intensity, what they've done is they've created an experience, and a lot of these, especially the larger scale ones, will have a very profound effect on you when you stand in front of them, but they may not contain any elements that are traceable back to actual reality. This approach was a backlash to the realism that had existed in most Western art anyway prior to the 20th century, and whatever you think of work like this, it definitely elicited a response of its own. And because of the lack of that connection to reality, abstract art requires more interpretation by default. Here, if we look at some of the work of the early expressionists, we can see that they're taking a figurative reality and adding to it an abstract sense of feeling and emotion and expression. So there's a lot more to say about that, but I want to keep it basic. I just wanted to show you how abstract art detaches itself away from reality in a way that creates another form of expression and communication. So on the other extreme we have what we call figurative art. Figurative just means that it's something concrete, that it's based on reality. So whereas abstract art detaches from reality, figurative art is meant to connect us to reality. So here, if we look at the late 19th century, we see work like the Pre-Raphaelites, where they were taking old mythological stories and trying to create emotional portraits to convey those stories. And then we have the Impressionists, who, while still working quite figuratively, are adding a little bit more of their own expression into the mix, bringing a little bit more emotion to the pieces. And where abstract art creates an experience, often figurative art is trying to relate an experience. Here we have some great examples of even more mundane experiences being put forth in a very figurative, very realistic way. These street scenes and this image of these tourists seem to be just everyday experiences that the artist had, that through these paintings and this sculpture have brought to life in a way that hands the experience over to us. And whereas abstract work had less limitation, I would argue that the limitations of trying to express reality just as we see it in a realistic fashion impose a lot more technical requirements on the part of the artist. Chuck Close, for example, spent months on end creating these enormous portraits of people to try to look just as real as the photographs that they were based on. The photorealist movement in particular did a pretty great job of blurring the line between photography and painting. Alright, well that's as good a segue as any. Let's talk about the photography side of things. Now, where I mentioned the two of the polar extremes in the painting world are between the abstract and the figurative, there's a similar polarization in photography between the documentary and the conceptual. Basically, documentary photography just means taking what already exists in the world and creating a document of it. If you want to get a sense for the documentary, look no further than street photography. Street photographers generally look for, wait for, plan ahead for a moment, but don't generally mess with anything that's there. They're more documentary. They want a candid representation of life in their own time. And this purity of documentary photography is taken even further in an extreme with photojournalism, where although the intent of the photographer comes through in their selection of what it is that they're covering, it's very important from an ethical standpoint not to change what's in front of you as a photojournalist. The photojournalist's job is the ultimate expression of documentary. Their intention is to capture the things that are actually happening in the world and report them back to the rest of the world. And none of this at all is to say that a documentary photographer doesn't bring artistic intention to the table. This is a great example here of how a documentary photographer's intention comes through their selection. In this infamous photo from this infamous moment by Thomas Hupker, he captures a group of young New Yorkers seemingly unfazed by the atrocity that's obviously happening in the background. And in an interview, he disclosed that he originally didn't like this shot at all. It didn't settle well. And then years later, he realized the story that was inherent within it, the dichotomy that it represented. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have conceptual photography. Conceptual photography is photography that does not rely on what already exists. Conceptual photography is in some way staged or modified by the photographer. In this realm, it's okay to do whatever it takes to get the message across. It's not simply captured the way that it existed. So in conceptual work, you can really see where the artistic intention of photographer is put up front. Here's some early examples of photographers who set up still lifes and abstractions to present to us something a little bit more abstract. This applies to a lot of still life and portrait work. And often conceptual photography is born from an idea and then created using the subject matter. Some conceptual photographers took this as far as to stage the entire image from the ground up. The fashion photographers like Cecil Beaton here are a great example, where although this might look like just a moment that was captured in time, this was actually painstakingly staged, and especially in this kind of work you find that the makeup and the hair and the outfits and the set and the lighting and everything are perfectly constructed in order to try to create the feeling in the image that they have in mind. And conceptual is becoming especially big nowadays with the advent of digital photography and digital manipulation, which has completely blurred the lines between documentary and conceptual work in a way that may be hard to separate moving forward in the future. So here are some great examples of using digital work for collage to take photographic elements and mix them together into something new. Alright, so between the documentary and the conceptual, just as there was between the abstract and the figurative in the painting world, you find a whole range of different ways of expressing your intent, of relaying your story or feeling or emotions about the world to a viewer. Conceptual photography, it's obvious where the intent comes from because the photographer and perhaps even a team of others construct the image from the ground up. Whereas it's a little more subtle in documentary photography, but it's not non-existent because the documentary photographer has to pay really close attention to what they're shooting. They must find themes that exist out in nature. Sometimes preparing for the moment when the light is just right. Going to the same place over and over and over, waiting for everything to just align in some magical way. So there's obviously a wide range of expression between painting and photography. Painters start with nothing but an idea or an intention, and they have to build everything up from there. Whereas often a photographer starts with reality and must deconstruct and edit away what they don't want to be there. So for example, when the painter creates a perfect frame, what exists within that frame is what they chose to put in there. Nothing is included that's not intended, so the intent of the artist is there from the very beginning and the rest follows. Photography is more of editing, especially let's take for example street photographers. You're walking down the street and the world is what it is, but for you to focus in on something and to create a composition from that, what you're really doing is paying very close attention to what you are not allowing into the frame. And it's easy in photography for one errant detail that you didn't notice to creep in there and belie your intentions. So painting is more of an additive process, whereas photography is often a more subtractive process. So back to this idea of painterly photography. I feel like somewhere in between the abstract and the figurative, in between the documentary and the conceptual, lies the truth of our experiences. And I think that's what draws me to painterly photography. We don't necessarily see the same way that the camera sees. When we look at a scene in front of us, we don't capture and memorialize every detail of that scene. So I would argue that paintings are a better representation of the way that we see the world. Often if you look at a painting, you'll notice that more detail and more attention and more contrast is given to the elements that the artist wanted you to pay attention to or notice. And just like when you walk into a room and then you're presented with a scene and your eye is drawn to what you find the most important, there are details that you're inevitably going to leave out. The painter just doesn't put these unimportant details in there in the first place. And so if as an artist our ideal is to let someone see through our eyes, but also to try to feel a little bit of what we feel, I think that painterly photography is a great way to do this. Art at its most reduced form is just a form of communication. And what better a communication than to hand someone over your own experience? And that's this intersection that I'm talking about. Your work is not too abstract to detach from the moment that you're sharing, nor is it too figurative and devoid of meaning. And if you can get your photography, like a painting, to represent both elements of the figurative and elements of the abstract, then you can convey both of those experiences to the viewer. So that's where I'm going to stop for now. Hopefully I've given you somewhat of a framework and some boundaries of the coming discussion. And in my next video in this series, I'm going to dig through a handful of artists that I feel represent this ideal for me. To achieve photography that is painterly requires a passion for detail and for process that has always really appealed to me. And through this series, I hope I can share a little bit of that love with you. So thanks as always for hanging out with me. If you have any questions about this, leave them down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. Until next time, peace.